Okay, welcome to today's class. I think you can hear my voice well, and I hope everything is all right with you. I hope you had a good holiday during last week. Okay, so this week we are going to continue with our discussions on identity. This week we will talk about European integration, the clash between the national identities and the newly constructed European identity, and we will talk about the fear of immigration. Okay, so it will be a very productive discussion this week because what we have been witnessing so far in Europe is that the national identities or attachment to national identities is increasing in almost all European countries, and in this context, there is a increased trend of the fear of immigration. We will talk about this problem both at the theoretical level and at the practical level in today's lecture. Okay, so as we all know, in the European Union, immigration has become a fact of life. When we look at the statistics, today approximately 37 million people born outside the European Union reside in the Union. So this population, this 38 million people, makes around 80%, roughly around 80% of the European Union's population, both inside the European Union and between the European Union and the rest of the world. Populations have become more mobile, moving for work, family, leisure, and also they are unfortunately fleeing persecution and war. Therefore, the immigration issue will remain a key feature of European societies for years to come. When we look at the Eurobarometer surveys uh, about public attitudes concerning various issues at the European Union level, we can see that the immigration issue is among the top three issues facing the European Union by 25% of the EU citizens. This means that um, one person in every four people within the EU considers immigration as an important problem or is an important issue within the European Union. This shows us that the issue of immigration is likely to remain a politically sensitive issue in the future as well. Okay, so upon this information, we have to ask ourselves, why do some people embrace the notion of European integration, but on the other hand, some other people oppose this view? So, what can be the theoretical reasons behind such an attitude? Okay. This question, in fact, has generated a considerable and a growing amount of scholarly research and popular debate. Scholars considered explanatory factors such as considerations of national pride and territorial identity, and some other scholars considered the national attachment and exclusive national identity, and even the fear of loss of national identity as the explanatory factors to such attitudes. Okay, in this lecture, We are going to briefly review each of these explanations. So, we will refer to these theoretical explanations about the fear of immigration or in general about the fear of European integration. And then we will discuss the relevance of anti-immigration sentiments in explaining the support for European integration. In these explanations, we will emphasize cultural threat as an important negative predictor for EU support. Okay, so let's start our analysis. The European Union is often referred to as an elitist project by the European people. In your other courses within this department, I'm sure you came across with this argument because the European Union was established by the technocrats, or so to say, bureaucrats working in Brussels and in Strasbourg and in other cities around Europe. These people were perceived as the common people, as elites, and they are dealing with some European issues which the common people are even not familiar with or even not aware of. Therefore, this elitist project does not have widespread public support among the EU citizens. For this reason, considerable effort has gone into exposing and analyzing the democratic deficit of the European Union. So, when we are talking about the democratic deficit, in this debate, we are referring to the notion of legitimacy. The legitimacy builds upon the principle of the authorization of power holders and responsiveness in the exercise of power plus accountability. So these issues are the basis of the democratic deficit problem of the European Union. And in this context, scholars and also the people criticizing the democratic deficit of the European Union as a lack of legitimacy in that the EU decisions are not sufficiently responsive to public preferences and scrutiny. What do we mean here? Common European citizens argue in the public surveys that they don't feel themselves involved in the decision making at the EU level because decision making is mostly reserved to the European Parliament, the Council of Ministers, and to the Commission. The people do not find themselves fit within this institutional structure. Therefore, they usually complain about that. The people are left out of the decision making of the European Union policies. When we look at the referendums on various European Union policies carried out in the EU member states, we can find the evidences of such complaints. Because in most of these referendums, we find a significant ratio of European citizens being against to these policies or to such developments. So when we look for the reasons or explanations to such attitudes, we find that people perceive a democratic deficit in the European Union mechanisms and institutions. And as we explained before, this democratic deficit includes the authorization of power holders, the responsiveness in the exercise of power at the EU level, and also the accountability principle. Okay, so however, in general, political systems are viable only on the condition that they enjoy considerable public support. So when we consider that the EU is criticized for having a democratic deficit, then it means that there is no such public support for the European integration or the mechanisms and institutions of the European integration. In the European Union, supranational means of law enforcement depends on public support and acceptance, certainly. And indeed, as we said before, the European integration is the most voted issue in the world because there are many referendums in the member states to decide on the issues of membership, sometimes on key policies, sometimes on the endorsement of new treaties and constitutional documents. And the number of these referendums is even increasing. Okay, so let's try to explain why these European citizens have doubts about European identity. Okay, okay, let's look at this subject through a theoretical perspective. Okay, so in the theoretical framework of this analysis, we should first of all consider the cost-benefit analysis. Okay, so European citizens firstly make a calculation of costs and benefits of this European integration. There are plenty of academic studies in the literature which argue that European Union citizens from different socioeconomic situations experience different costs and benefits from the integration policy. These academic studies explain the support for European integration in terms of income, education, occupational skills, and proximity to border regions. In these studies, national economic pride and satisfaction are stated as key explanatory variables in support for the integration across the European Union countries. Secondly, there are references to the domestic politics. Okay, so how the preferences over domestic politics impact upon the views and attitudes on European integration. There are several academic studies on this subject, and they explain that the key political variables that come from the domestic political realm actually impacts on citizens' perceptions and attitudes of the European integration. The argument here is that uh, because people have low level of actual information about the European integration, they are likely to resort to their information on domestic politics when formulating their views on European integration. Therefore, their views would be based on their national political considerations. In particular, the importance of government approval and support for the political parties are considered in terms of preference and support for European integration. What do we mean here? Let's give an example. Okay, so as we said before, many European Union member states are holding referendums over key aspects of European integration, such as ratification of a new treaty or ratification of a new policy, etc. And in these situations, many European citizens do not have significant deal of information on these policies or on these treaties. However, they are still going to vote on these issues. And when making up their attitude towards these policies or issues, they consider their preferences in terms of domestic politics. So, if the incumbent political parties support these policies, and if these common people are also supporting the incumbent political parties, then they positively vote for these issues. And otherwise, they vote negative in such issues. Therefore, there is the considerable impact of people's preferences in terms of domestic policies upon their attitudes towards the European integration. Okay, let's come to the third theoretical factor when explaining people's attitudes and perceptions of the European integration. Of course, this is relevant to the national identity and the threats to national and cultural integrity. This is our main explanation in today's lecture. So, when you look at the literature, you can find several studies on this subject, and these studies suggest that citizens' feeling of national attachment and their perceptions of threats to the national state and to the nation's interests and cultural integrity are potential considerations when expressing support for the EU policies. Let's give an example to that to make it clear. Okay, for example, consider the Switzerland. Okay, for the Swiss case, perceived threats to national interests is a strong factor impacting on the support for the European Union. This perceived threat is strongly related to the Swiss people's perceived image of neighboring countries and to their attachment to core Swiss values. A strong national identity and perceptions of negative consequences of EU membership for the general economy are directly and negatively related to support for membership. So this explanation is provided based on the economic considerations. Okay? In other academic studies, there's another explanation taken as a basic premise. So, these studies consider the perceived threat to national interests as generating a reluctance about integration because people view or perceive the integration as a cultural threat. So this explanation is provided through the lens of national identity and a cultural threat. The basic premise of this explanation is that changing nature of the nation and the nation state will lead many Europeans to be critical of the European integration. The idea of advanced European integration implies for these people a potentially weakened role for the nation state, and a redistribution of sovereignty. So, this poses a threat to the symbolic value of the nation state. So, here we have seen two different perceptions, considering the case study on Switzerland. As you see, both of these perceptions frame their threat argument in terms of feeling of national identity and national attachment. But there's one essential difference between these two perceptions. The conceptualization of threat differs considerably between these two explanations. One of these explanations argue that it is the protection of the in-group identity, and this is the national identity, that is under threat. On the other hand, the other explanation argues that strength of national identity is related to EU support as well as to the perceived threat to national interests of EU integration. Okay, so we have seen different explanations to the for the perception of European integration by the European citizens, and different explanations for their attitudes towards European integration. Now we will talk about fear of immigration and the perceived cultural threats to through this immigration concept. Okay, as we have said before, the issue of immigration has become increasingly important in Europe in the recent years. As you can see on TV news, on newspapers, the anti-immigration sentiment is increasing throughout Europe. And also, there is a rise in right-wing populist parties across Europe. So, anti-immigration attitudes became an important predictor of opposition to European integration. They suggest that people who perceive immigration as a cultural threat are more likely to oppose further EU integration because they associate it with the potential for increased immigration and the erosion of national culture. In recent years, anti-immigration sentiments have becoming citizens' attitudes in a number of European countries. The popularity of populist anti-immigrant parties serve as an indicator of the relevance and significance of immigration-related attitudes of the European citizens. Okay, so let's try to explain why people's attitudes towards immigration are related to their support for European integration. So let's try to establish the connections between these two frameworks. Okay, and again, we are going to do this theoretically, and in the next session, we are going to move on the practical analysis of this issue. So let's take a theoretical approach for the explanation of why people's attitudes towards immigration directly relates to their support for European integration. Okay. So, Since the beginning of this course, we are talking about how people construct their identities and how they define the in-group members and out-group members. So essentially, this is the definition of us and other. So people categorize themselves and others into groups. And this is the central and common factor in the formation of hostility towards immigrants. Social identity theory informs us that based upon such group categorizations, people tend to show a favorable bias towards the members of their own group and an unfavorable bias against the members of other groups. What does it mean? Okay, so people in the context of identity politics have a tendency to make in-group versus out-group distinctions. So in this context, in the framework of construction of us and others, people make distinctions between the in-group members and the out-group members. So people who categorize the immigrants as an out-group are also likely to show hostility towards immigrants. These people hold negative attitudes towards immigrants and therefore they are more likely to reject the idea of further European integration. I hope this explanation is clear. So, in this theoretical explanation, it is not in-group favoritism, but rather a negative out-group bias, which is indicated by hostility towards immigrants. Okay, so in this theoretical conceptualization, we essentially build upon the identity politics. And since the beginning of this course, we are repeating that people construct group identities based upon us and others. And there are the in-group members and the out-group members in this conceptualization. Therefore, people who tend to categorize immigrants as out-group also show hostility towards these immigrants. So these people who have negative attitudes towards immigrants also reject the idea of further European integration because it is the European integration which brings in these immigrants. Okay, so this theoretical argument is advocated by several academic studies. Let's give some examples here to make it clear. Okay, so there's an article written by McLaren in 2002, and in this research, McLaren demonstrated the importance of immigration attitudes in understanding support for European integration. There's another work written by Hoge and Marx in 2005, and in this work, individuals feel threatened by immigration are more likely to oppose European integration as well. So, as we said before, they perceive it as exacerbating the immigration issue and threatening their national identity. So, this is in line with our previously mentioned theoretical foundations, and these studies prove that these theoretical assumptions are actually correct, are actually empirically validated throughout academic research. So let's repeat it once more. Individuals who feel threatened by immigration are more likely to oppose European integration, as we discussed in our theoretical foundation part. Because these people perceive that European integration exacerbates the immigration issue, and this issue threatens their national identity. Okay, so these are the academic studies proving these theoretical assumptions, and also in the academic literature, there are other studies who argue that the perceived cultural threat of immigration can interact with other factors as well. These factors are national identity and economic concerns. For example, individuals with strong national attachments perceive immigration as a threat to their national culture. So these people would be more likely to oppose the European integration. These people would be ready to show negative out-group bias towards immigrants, and therefore they would oppose further European integration. Because in their conceptualization, European integration would be increasing this threat by the immigration, and because they conceptualize the immigrants as the outgroup members, through which they perceive, they have the negative perception, so they will certainly oppose further European integration as the mechanism triggering this immigration problem. Okay, so let me consider these various explanations for public support or public opposition to European integration. It is important for us to recognize that these factors are actually not mutually exclusive because individuals are not usually impacted or influenced by one of these factors only. But in general, in the real life, individuals are influenced by multiple factors simultaneously, right? So when some of the European citizens have the fear of immigration, they wouldn't describe only the economic factors or only the national identity as the possible explanations to this fear. Um, just give an example. An European citizen may oppose to the European integration due to his or her concerns about the erosion of national sovereignty as well as the perceived cultural threat of increased immigration as well as the perceived economic threat by this immigration. So there might be several different explanations at the same time. Therefore, although we describe several different explanations for the fear of immigration, therefore, for the lack of support for European integration, we should also keep in mind that multiple factors can be in action or within the context of explanation for such attitudes simultaneously. Okay, so right now we have 4 minutes to the end of this session. So I will move on to explanations for these fear of immigration um, in the in the literature, and in the last 4 minutes it's not plausible to start and finish this discussion, so I want to stop now, and in the next session we will start with these other explanations for the fear of immigration. So we will clarify the issues that we have discussed so far, and we will give some more examples. We will elaborate upon these theoretical explanations, and then after finishing this theoretical analysis, we will move on to the practical to the practical analysis of the attitudes towards immigration in the European Union. So I'm stopping at this point, and we will continue our discussion in the next session. Thank you very much for listening.